500 guests. Crystal chandeliers so large and so bright they turned the entire ceiling into a second sky. A ballroom built on a private island estate so exclusive that the invitations were delivered by hand, not email, because the people in this room did not accept digital anything. They accepted results. They accepted power. They accepted the unspoken understanding that when Silas Vance hosted a gala, you arrived on time, you dressed immaculately, and you understood without being told that you were standing in the presence of something larger than money, something older than wealth, something that had no name except legacy. Serafina Vance stood near the edge of the glass stage in a gown the color of deep ivory, floor length, draped over the full curve of her 8-month belly like something poured and then set. Her dark hair was pinned at the nape of her neck. Her earrings were her grandmother's, 2 drops of pale gold that caught the light every time she turned her head. She stood with her shoulders back and her chin level, the way her father had taught her to stand since she was 4 years old, not as performance, as identity. Her husband was at the podium. Julian Crest, 39, jaw-sharp and charming in the way that only certain kinds of dangerous men are charming, held a glass of $50,000 cognac in one hand and the microphone in the other. He had been giving a toast, the annual address honoring the Vance family's charitable legacy. It was supposed to be gracious, warm, the kind of carefully constructed tribute that a devoted son-in-law delivers when 500 of the world's most consequential people are listening, and every word lands in a room that will be discussing it for years. Julian veered off script somewhere between the second paragraph and the third glass. "My wife," he said, and he smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Serafina, she is many things." He paused, swirled the cognac. "Beautiful, without question, educated, impressively so." He chuckled, and the chuckle was easy practice, the sound of a man who believes the room belongs to him. "But if we are being honest tonight, among friends, among people who understand how the real world works." He looked directly at her, not with cruelty on the surface, with something worse, amusement. "My wife is like a broken watch, beautiful to look at, but ultimately useless for anything but taking up space." The word landed the way a stone lands in still water. Not a gasp, something quieter than a gasp. 500 people simultaneously deciding where to look, deciding, as a single organism, that they needed to examine their champagne flutes, the centerpieces, the distant middle distance, anywhere except at the pregnant woman standing 6 feet from the man who had just said that word about her in public, in front of everyone who mattered in the known world. From the front row, a woman in a crimson dress laughed. Not loud, not long, just enough. Serafina registered it from the corner of her eye without turning her head. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She did not step backward or press her lips together, or let her eyes go glassy the way eyes do when a human being is trying to contain something enormous inside a body that was not built for containment. She stood exactly where she was, and she raised her left hand slowly, the way a woman reaches for something familiar in the dark, and she touched the necklace at her throat. A single pendant, brushed platinum, small enough to be mistaken for ornamental. Her fingers rested on it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she lowered her hand. The baby kicked. Hard. Once and then again, and then a third time in rapid succession, as though even the child had heard it and was registering something that the mother above was choosing, deliberately and with great precision, not to show. Serafina pressed her palm flat against the side of her belly, just for a moment, a gesture so small it was barely visible, a conversation only the two of them were having. She had met Julian at 31. She had believed, in the specific and uncomplicated way that intelligent women sometimes believe in the wrong people, that he was the exception, that beneath the ambition and the tailored suits and the manner he wore like a second skin, there was a man who understood what he had been given when Silas Vance sat across a dinner table from him and shook his hand and said, "Welcome to our family." She had believed that for 4 years. She had stopped believing it gradually. The way you stop believing in a story you have read too many times, when the language starts to look different to you, when the words that once felt warm begin to feel constructed. She had not, however, stopped watching. She found her father across the ballroom. Silas Vance stood at his table near the window, 67 years old, silver-suited, the kind of physical stillness that a person only develops after a lifetime of deciding that reaction is a resource, and resources are not to be wasted. He had not moved. His napkin was folded on his lap. His water glass sat untouched. He was looking at Julian the way a man looks at a calculation he has already completed, the answer already written, the working already done, the only remaining task to show the room the solution. Silas did not rush. He never rushed. He set down his water glass, smoothed his jacket, stood. The room tracked him like a single living thing following a single light source. His footsteps on the marble were the only sound in the ballroom. Measured. Absolute. He climbed the 3 steps to the stage, stood beside Julian, and reached out with one hand, and he took the microphone the way you take something from someone who should never have been holding it. Julian's smile faltered, fractionally, just enough. Silas turned to face the room, and when he spoke, his voice was warm. "My son-in-law," he said, "has reminded me tonight of something I built this foundation to address, the startling ease with which some people assign worth to others." He paused, not for drama, for precision. "Tonight, we are here for children who need hospitals, children who need books, children who have been told in ways large and small that they are less than they are." He reached into his jacket and produced a checkbook. He wrote a number without hesitation, held the check up between 2 fingers and turned to the event coordinator. $5 million for the new wing, tonight. The room erupted. 500 people rose to their feet, and the applause crashed and built, and Silas Vance stepped off the stage without looking at Julian once, without needing to, because Julian was still standing at the podium in a spotlight that no longer belonged to him, holding cognac that no longer tasted like anything, in front of 500 witnesses who had just watched the most powerful man in the room treat him like a footnote. Serafina did not stay to watch the rest. She moved through the crowd quietly, past the waiters with their silver trays, past the women who suddenly discovered fascinating things about their bracelets, past the glass wall overlooking the black water below. She found the east terrace and stepped outside. The night air came off the ocean cold and immediate and clean. She stood at the railing and breathed. Below her, the water moved in the dark, enormous and indifferent and old, the way oceans are, the way things are when they have existed long enough to no longer require an audience. Her phone vibrated in her clutch. She opened it. One message, no name, no number she recognized. 2 words only. Phase 3 confirmed. Serafina read it once, closed the message, closed her eyes, pressed one hand to her belly where her daughter was still, finally, peacefully still, as though she had decided for now that everything was going to be exactly as it needed to be. Serafina exhaled slowly. And for the first time all evening, she allowed herself the smallest, most private, most dangerous thing she had felt since Julian opened his mouth at that podium. Not relief, not yet. Something closer to certainty. The morning after the gala, Julian was charming. That was the thing about him that Serafina had studied longest and understood most completely. Not his ambition, not his cruelty, not even his greed. His charm. The ease with which he could move from one version of himself to another, the way water moves through differently shaped containers, always filling the space, always taking the form that served him best. Over breakfast, he was attentive. He poured her tea without being asked. He asked about her sleep. He touched her hand across the table and said, with a softness that would have convinced almost anyone, that he had spoken carelessly the night before, that the cognac had been stronger than he realized, that he would call her father and apologize before the week was out. She told him not to worry. She smiled the way she had been smiling at him for the past several months, warm, unconcerned, the specific and carefully maintained smile of a woman who has decided that the most powerful thing she can do, for now, is appear to have decided nothing at all. He kissed her forehead before he left for his office and told her to rest. She waited until she heard the car leave the private drive. Then she walked to the study, sat at the desk by the window, and opened her encrypted tablet. The morning light came through the glass and lit the surface of the water in the bay below, turning it the color of hammered silver. She did not look at the water. She opened the folder she had built over 22 months of patient, methodical, relentless work, and she reviewed what she already knew, because knowing it once had never been enough. She needed to know it the way a surgeon knows anatomy. Every layer, every connection, every point at which the structure could be entered and the damage made irreversible. Julian believed he had been building an empire. What he had actually been doing was borrowing one. Every luxury he had purchased in 4 years of marriage, the fleet of supercars he called his collection, the private jet he referred to as his aircraft, the penthouse in the city he described to his associates as his investment, every single one had been financed through companies he had never thought to trace to their origin. He had signed the contracts because the terms were favorable, because the rates were low, because the access was immediate, and because Julian Crest had never in his life read the fine print of anything he wanted badly enough. The shell companies he borrowed from were layered, structured, and buried in a configuration that would take a specialist years to map cleanly. Serafina had mapped it in 4 months. Every entity traced back to the same origin. A holding group incorporated quietly in a jurisdiction that asked few questions. The registered agent of that holding group was a name she had seen on exactly one other document in her lifetime: the founding deed of the Vance family private office. Signed by her father at 31, in the year before she was born, in the year he decided that the only way to build something that could not be taken was to make sure that everything connected to it, invisibly and completely, connected back to him. Julian did not own a single asset he believed was his. He owed $400 million, and the clock on that debt had been running since the morning after their wedding. She closed the folder and drove to her father's estate. Silas was in his private office on the upper floor, the room with no art on the walls and no furniture except a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the full length of the island. He was reviewing documents when she arrived, and he set them aside without being asked, the way he always did, because Silas Vance had never once made his daughter feel that anything else in the room was more important than she was. He slid a dossier across the desk. Serafina opened it. The woman in the photographs was Isabella Rain, 34, fluent in 4 languages, a graduate of 2 institutions that did not appear on any public registry. Her professional history, the real one, not the one Julian had been shown, spanned 11 years of corporate intelligence work across 3 continents. She had been placed in Julian's orbit 2 years ago through a professional introduction so meticulously arranged that it had the texture of coincidence. She had been given a legend, a cover, and a clear directive. Get close, let him talk, let him plan, let him commit. Every conversation Julian believed was private had been documented. Every scheme he had outlined to the woman he thought was his confidant had been recorded, filed, and preserved in a chain of evidence that no defense attorney alive would be able to meaningfully challenge. Isabella had never been Julian's. She had always been Silas Vance's. Serafina turned the last page of the dossier and set it on the desk and did not speak for a moment. Not because she was surprised. She had suspected the shape of this for months, had felt the architecture of it in the way certain things moved too cleanly, the way certain doors opened at exactly the right time. But suspicion and confirmation are different weights, and she let herself feel the full measure of what had been built around her, for her, before she said anything at all. Then she came to the document her father placed in front of her last. She recognized her own signature immediately. Julian had produced that paper 6 weeks ago, presenting it as a routine estate planning form, something her legal team had requested to ensure the trust provisions were correctly structured ahead of the birth. She had signed it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon while he stood behind her and talked about something else entirely. His voice easy, his posture relaxed, the performance of a man with nothing to hide because he believed no one was watching. She had signed it, but what she had signed was not what he had told her it was. The language embedded in the body of the document, beneath the standard formatting, beneath the clauses that looked procedural and unremarkable, was a detailed admission, a legally binding statement, in Julian's own constructed framing but under her attributed authority, confessing to coercion, racketeering, and the fraudulent manipulation of trust instruments for personal gain. The document he thought gave him control over her assets had, through a reversal so clean it was almost elegant, made him the named party in his own prosecution. By pressuring her to sign it, Julian had signed his own confession. Her father's attorney had drafted the language. Serafina stared at the page for a long time. Silas said nothing. He waited, the way he always waited, with the patience of a man who understood that silence, applied correctly, was the most effective pressure in existence. Then he said the only thing he ever asked her in moments like this. "What do you want to do?" Serafina looked out the window at the island below, at the water surrounding it on every side, at the horizon where the sky met the ocean in a line so clean and absolute it looked drawn. "I want him to believe he has already won," she said, "right up until the moment he understands that he hasn't." Silas nodded once. She drove home. Julian was back by evening in good spirits, loosened from the tension of the night before, moving through the house with the particular energy of a man who has decided that a problem has resolved itself. He poured himself a drink at the kitchen counter, leaned against it, and told her he had something planned. A surprise, he called it, for the Vance Foundation's closing gala in 48 hours. An announcement he had been preparing for weeks. Something that was going to, in his words, change everything. He did not tell her what the announcement was. He did not need to, she already knew. He thought the document she had signed gave him administrative authority over the Vance estate management structure. He intended to stand in front of 500 witnesses and declare himself its new steward. He had rehearsed. She could tell by the way he was already moving through the words in his head, by the small unconscious adjustments to his posture, by the way his eyes went to the middle distance and came back satisfied. She told him it sounded exciting. She asked if he wanted dinner. He said yes and disappeared into the living room, and she stood at the kitchen counter and listened to him rehearse under his breath, the soft, measured cadence of a man building toward a moment he believed was going to define him. She set the pot on the stove, turned the heat to low, let him rehearse. The stage, after all, was already built. The lighting was already set. Every seat in that ballroom had already been assigned to exactly the right person, in exactly the right position, for exactly the right reason. He just did not know yet what kind of production he had bought a ticket to. The Vance Foundation's closing gala began the way it always began, with beauty so deliberate it felt like an argument. The same ballroom, the same crystal chandeliers throwing their light across the same marble floors, white roses on every table, arranged with the kind of precision that does not happen by accident. 500 guests in evening wear, the same 500 who had stood in this room 48 hours earlier and heard a word that did not belong in a room like this, spoken by a man who did not belong in a family like this. They were back, all of them, and every single one of them knew that what they were attending tonight was not simply a foundation gala. They had been in enough rooms with Silas Vance over enough decades to understand what it meant when he expanded the guest list, adjusted the seating, and said nothing publicly about why. It meant something was coming. It meant he had already decided how it ended. Serafina arrived at 7 in the evening in the same ivory gown she had worn to the first gala, altered slightly at the seam to accommodate the final weeks of her pregnancy, because she had chosen that detail deliberately, because she wanted anyone in that room who remembered the night Julian opened his mouth to understand that she had not hidden, had not diminished, had not rearranged herself around his cruelty. She had simply continued. She walked in with her shoulders back and her hand resting lightly on her belly, and the room noticed her the way rooms notice things that carry a particular kind of gravity. Julian was already inside. He stood near the bar with a glass in hand, talking to two men Serafina recognized as associates from his professional circle, his posture open and confident, the posture of a man who has told himself that tonight is his night. He crossed the room to her when he saw her, kissed her cheek, placed his hand on her belly for the benefit of anyone watching, and told her she looked extraordinary. She thanked him. She meant none of it, and she said it perfectly. Silas took the stage at 8 o'clock. He moved through the opening remarks with the measured authority of a man who has something specific in mind, and is not interested in rushing toward it, because rushing implies uncertainty, and Silas Vance had not been uncertain about anything in this room since the night the plan began. He spoke about the Foundation's work. He spoke about the hospital wing. He thanked the donors by name, each acknowledgement precise and genuine, because whatever else was happening tonight, the children the Foundation served were real, and their needs were real, and Silas had never once used them as backdrop for anything personal. Julian watched from the head table. His knee moved slightly under the tablecloth, the small rhythmic tell of a man waiting for his moment. He had been waiting for this for weeks. The announcement he had prepared, the authority he believed the signed document had transferred to him. He had rehearsed it until the words came without effort, until the delivery felt inevitable. Silas paused at the podium. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, placed them in his breast pocket, and looked out over the room the way a man looks at something he has built and understood completely. "Before we continue," he said, "I would like to share something." The murmur of 500 people settled into silence. "Most of you know my daughter. You have watched her build this Foundation's programs from the ground up. You have watched her raise nearly $500,000 in independent funding this year alone. You have watched her carry a child with grace and dignity through circumstances that would have broken most people." He paused. 48 hours ago, in this room, my son-in-law stood at this podium and called her useless. No one moved. Silas let the words sit in the air exactly long enough. "Tonight," he said, "I would like to define the term correctly." He pressed a button on the podium. The lights cut. Every chandelier, every candle, every ambient source in the ballroom extinguished in the same instant, and the darkness that followed was total and absolute, and lasted exactly long enough to feel significant. And then, into that darkness, came a voice through every speaker in the room, calm and even and carrying the specific weight of a man who has never once needed volume to be heard. "You called her useless, Julian. In my world, useless is a man who signs contracts he has not read." The lights returned. Behind the podium, the large projection screen that the Foundation used for impact photography blazed to life, and what it showed was not a photograph. It was a number. Julian Crest, net worth, live in real time, displayed on a screen large enough for every person in the room to read without difficulty. And the number was moving, not upward. A digital ticker, cold and mechanical and utterly indifferent, counting down through the liquidation of every offshore account, every asset Julian believed was his, every holding he had built his identity around. The room watched in complete silence as the figure moved through millions, and then through hundreds of thousands, and then through tens of thousands, and then, at exactly 60 seconds from the moment the ticker began, the screen settled on a number so simple and so complete that it required no explanation. 0. Julian stood up. His chair scraped the marble floor, and the sound of it cut through the ballroom like a blade. His face had gone the color of something drained, and his mouth was open, and he looked at the screen the way a person looks at something they cannot yet fully process, because the brain requires more time than the moment is willing to give. He turned toward the front row. Isabella Rain sat where she had sat 48 hours earlier, in a dress the deep color of crimson, composed and still and watching him with an expression that contained no apology and no performance and no trace of the woman he believed she had been for 2 years. She stood slowly. She reached into the small clutch on the table beside her. She placed a badge on the white linen, face up, so that anyone near the front of the room could read it without difficulty. Then she raised her phone, and she pressed play. Julian's own voice filled the ballroom. The recording from 48 hours ago, clean and clear and unmistakable, every word precise, every syllable exactly as he had delivered it. My wife is like a broken watch, beautiful to look at, but ultimately useless for anything but taking up space. The room heard it a second time, and the second time was worse than the first, because now they heard it with the full context of everything the screen had just shown them, and the two things together formed a picture that no amount of charm could dissolve. Isabella looked at Julian across the distance between them with the calm of someone who has completed a very long piece of work, and found it exactly as expected. Intent to defraud, she said, coercion of a pregnant spouse, racketeering. It is all documented, all preserved, and all submitted. She held up the handcuffs in her other hand. We have been waiting 2 years for you to give us the clearest possible evidence of intent. You gave it to us in front of 500 witnesses. Julian looked at her. He looked at the screen. He looked at Silas at the podium. He looked at Serafina at the head table, seated with both hands resting on her belly, watching him with an expression that was not triumphant and was not grieving and was not angry, an expression that was simply clear, the expression of a woman who has known exactly how this moment would arrive and has been carrying that knowledge alone for a very long time. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The federal agents at the perimeter of the room moved with the efficiency of people who have rehearsed a specific action enough times that it requires no discussion. Julian was escorted from the ballroom through the East Service exit, away from the cameras and the guests and the chandeliers and the white roses, into a corridor that had no grandeur and no audience and no cognac, just the sound of footsteps on plain tile and a door at the end that closed behind him. Serafina did not watch him leave. She was already moving. She walked through the ballroom and out onto the terrace, the same terrace she had stood on 48 hours ago when a 2-word message had arrived on her phone and she had allowed herself, for the first time, to feel certain. The ocean was below her, black and enormous and entirely unchanged, because oceans do not rearrange themselves for human events, and she had always loved that about them. She reached up and unclasped the watch from her left wrist. Julian had given it to her in the first year of their marriage. A slim gold thing, expensive and beautiful, the kind of gift that announces itself. She had worn it every day since. She had been wearing it the night he stood at a podium and used the image of a broken watch to describe what he thought she was, and she had kept wearing it every day after that, because she needed it where she could see it, because some things need to remain visible until the moment arrives when you are ready to let them go. She held it over the railing. The water moved in the dark below. She opened her fingers. The watch fell without a sound, or perhaps it made a sound and the ocean simply absorbed it, the way the ocean absorbs everything, quietly, completely, without ceremony. Serafina placed both hands on her belly. Value is something you create, she said softly, to the child moving gently beneath her palms. Not something you are given, and when someone calls you useless, that is not a fact about you. That is a confession about them, a confession that they have nothing left to offer, that they looked at something extraordinary and could not understand what they were looking at. The ocean moved below her. The lights of the ballroom glowed behind her. She felt her daughter shift, slow and deliberate, settling deeper, as though she had heard every word and found them sufficient. Footsteps on the terrace. She did not need to turn to know who it was. The particular weight of that step, the unhurried certainty of it, had been the sound of safety her entire life. Silas stood beside her and looked out at the water. He did not say that she had been brave, because he had raised her to understand that bravery is not a compliment. It is a baseline. It is the floor and not the ceiling. He did not say that it was over, because endings are also beginnings, and he had lived long enough to know the difference between the two was not always clear on the night itself. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her the way he had always stood beside her, present, certain, immovable in the way that only people who have chosen something completely are immovable. The ocean took the darkness and held it. The baby was still. And Serafina Vance stood on the edge of everything that came next, with her father beside her and her daughter ahead of her, and she did not look back.